Okay, so this is the second part of my presentation on the Tower of Babel. Okay, folks, so of course, at a glance at a grammar for any particular language, says the author, will reveal dozens or hundreds of idiosyncrasies. Okay? Then he makes reference to a linguist, Joseph Greenberg, who in 1963 examined a sample of 30 far-flung languages from 5 continents, including Serbian, Italian, Basque, Finnish, Swahili, Nubian, Maasai, Berber, Turkish, Hebrew, Hindi, Japanese, Burmese, Malay, Maori, Mayan, and Quechua. And although he was not working within the Chomsky School, he found no fewer than 45 universals. Okay, and of importance is to say that the largest number of universals that Greenberg came up with involve implications of this sort. If a language has X, it will also have Y, right? We came across a typical example of an implicational universal in chapter 4, one that we study. If the basic order of a language is SOV, as we are noting down now, it will usually have question words at the end of the sentence and postpositions. Then if it is SVO, just like English and Spanish are, it will have question words at the beginning of questions and prepositions. So universal implications are found in all aspects of language, from phonology. For example, if a language has a nasal vowel or nasal vowels, it will also have non-nasal ones, to word meanings. Now, okay, so then he poses an interesting question. This one: if lists of universals show that languages do not vary freely, do they imply that languages are restricted by the structure of the brain? Not directly. First, one must rule out 2 alternative explanations. And he provides the 2 explanations that I think you can access by yourselves. But of importance is that he points out what I'm interested in pointing out, and you're remembering yourselves. Greenbergisms are not the best place, so those following what Greenberg did are not the best place to look for a neurologically given universal grammar that existed before Babel. Babel, this, biblical reference to, which is explicit at the beginning of this chapter, to this moment in the creation of the world in which God decided that humans be scattered all over the planet, the earth, each one speaking their own tongue, right? Being unable to understand one another. For Greenberg, what Greenberg did was focus on, lists of vocabulary items instead of tracing, the patterns and reconstructing, the structures that made up the grammars of the languages that he analyzed. He carried out what one may say a more superficial type of analysis by looking at vocabulary items in isolation, not at patterns and structures that surfaced up, from these languages put to use in actual instances of use. So what he suggests we do, Pinker, is the following. It is the organization of grammar as a whole, not some laundry list of facts, that we should be looking at. All right? And then he says, what is most striking of all is that we can look at a randomly picked language and find things that can sensibly be called subjects, objects, and verbs to begin with. Okay? And then, skipping a few lines and going to this section, Chomsky's claim that from a Martian's eye view, all humans speak a single language is based on the discovery that the same symbol manipulating machinery, without exception, underlies the world's languages. Linguists have long known that the basic design features of language are found everywhere. So, skipping again a few sections and going to this last paragraph, Chomskyan linguistics in combination with Greenbergian surveys allows us to go well beyond this basic spec sheet. All languages. So it is safe, I was going to skip it, but I will not. It is safe to say that the grammatical machinery we used for English in chapters 4 through 6 is used in all the world's languages. That is, all languages have a vocabulary in the thousands or tens of thousands, stored into part of speech categories, including noun and verb. Words are organized into phrases according to the expert system that we referred to with respect to chapter 4 here. The higher levels of phrase structure include auxiliaries that show inflection, which signify tense, modality, aspect, and negation. This is found across languages. Nouns are marked for case. In our languages of specialization, it is pronouns, personal pronouns, and assigns semantic roles. This is what we talked about when dealing with the fact that the verb is a little despot that not only selects for the role players associated with its meaning, but also assigns to them specific roles: the role of patient, the role of agent, the role of beneficiary. Okay? By the mental dictionary entry of the verb or other predicate. Here comes the notion predicate that I was making reference to before in my first video with respect to chapter 4. So, well, I will not write any comment here, but remember, make this connection to what I already said. Phrases can be moved from their deep structure positions, leaving a gap or trace by a structure-dependent movement rule, by a rule, don't worry about this label, thereby forming questions, relative clauses, passives, and other constructions. So remember that there can be two levels of analysis. Deep structure is what we find, in a simple sentence that satisfies, the requirements of the predicate that functions as predicator, and that indicates how many role players, how many arguments it should be accompanied by to make sense, to make a grammatical sentence. Then in derived, all of these questions, relative clauses, passives may be called derived sentences, because they derive from the more basic, the more canonical ones. the more basic and canonical ones that satisfy the requirements of the predicate, for example, the verb give or put, and the selection that it makes of specific role players that should accompany it. Then in a question, we may have one of the role players, elided, deleted from the surface expression or structure. But we can still understand that it exists at a deep structure level. And this happens across languages. New word structures can be created and modified by derivational and inflectional rules, so present across languages. Inflectional rules primarily mark nouns for case and number, and mark verbs for tense, for aspect, for mood, for voice, for negation. And agreement with subjects and objects in number, gender, and person is also the case cross-linguistically. The phonological forms of words are defined by metrical and syllable trees and separate tiers of features like voicing, tone, and manner and place of articulation, and are subsequently adjusted by ordered phonological rules. So phonology, the realm of sound patterning, and the patternings that are allowed for in each of the languages. And these, terms, voicing, tone, manner, and place of articulation pertaining to phonetics, and then the ruling that is permitted in each of the languages, also part of all languages in the world. Though many of these arrangements are in some sense useful, they are details found in language after language, but not in any other artificial system. In any artificial system like Fortran or musical notation, give a strong impression that a universal grammar, not reducible to history or cognition, underlies the human language instinct. Right? So here cognition pertains to the realm of, learning, that is not reducible to what we are taught consciously, to what we learn consciously, but rather to our predisposition, innate predisposition, to this instinct that we are endowed with the moment we are born human. So then he says, in addition to vocabulary, whether the word for mouse is mouse or souris, a few properties of language are simply not specified in this genetic endowment, right, in universal grammar, and can vary as parameters. For example, it is up to each language to choose whether the order of elements within a phrase is head first or head last, right? To say eat sushi and to say to Chicago versus sushi it and Chicago too. And whether a subject is mandatory in all sentences or can be omitted when the speaker desires. The overall impression is that universal grammar is like an archetypal body plan found across vast numbers of animals in a phylum, meaning languages. So this archetypal body plan that I called, so as to make this point clearer, a template that is found across languages. So moving on a little bit to the section in which he says, let me pause it and organize my thoughts. So I wanted to take up from here. There seems to be a common plan of syntactic, morphological, and phonological rules and principles, with a small set of varying parameters, like a checklist of options. Right here. One set, so the parameter, as it is hypothesized here, comes with options associated with it. For example, to allow for the dropping of subjects in declarative sentences, or not to allow for such an option. then the language sets, our brain sets the parameter in accordance to what happens around us in the linguistic environment that we are surrounded by. And this, the moment it is set, then it can have a far-reaching, consequence, far-reaching changes on the superficial appearance of the language. For if it is set, positively, therefore allowing for the omission of subjects in declarative sentences, then the language will look pretty much like Spanish, in which we only find the specification of subjects in declarative sentences under certain, circumstances. Otherwise, we can always do away with such specification, for the inflections in the verb do the job that a subject pronoun, that a nominal, does in languages like English. Now, let me refer now to a piece in the New York Times. This is from 2002, but I think it is still relevant that you go to the piece and read it. You can Google it under the following heading: Expert says he discerns hardwired grammar rules. And it is in particular the introductory section to this article that I'm interested in your reading and understanding and making connections with what we're saying here in Pinker's chapter 8. So let's take a look. In 1981, the linguist Noam Chomsky, who had already proposed that language was not learned but innate, made an even bolder claim. The grammars of all languages, he said, can be described by a set of universal rules or principles, and the differences among those grammars are due to a finite set of options that are also innate. If grammar were bread, then flour and liquid would be the universal rules. The options, parameters, Dr. Chomsky called them, would be things like yeast, eggs, sugar, jalapenos, any of which yield a substantially different product when added to the universals, in line with what we said here. Once set, a parameter can have far-reaching changes on the superficial appearance of the language. The theory would explain why grammars vary only within a narrow range, despite the tremendous number and diversity of languages. And then the article continues, but I think this, it's 3 paragraphs, really shed light on this section in Pinker's book, chapter. Please continue reading, because I think it is really illuminating in its entirety, but I just wanted to make this quick connection. So, if there is a single plant just beneath the surfaces of the world's languages, then any basic property of one language should be found in all the others. Therefore, he suggests that we re-examine the 6 supposedly un-English language traits that open the chapter. A closer look shows that all of them can also be found right here in English, and that the supposedly distinctive traits of English can be found in the other languages. With respect to number 1, English, like the inflecting languages it supposedly differs from, has an agreement marker, the third person singular S in he walks, that I referred to in my own presentation. It also has case distinctions in the pronouns, such as he versus him. And like agglutinating languages, it has machinery that can glue many bits together into a long word, which is what agglutinating languages do, like the derivational rules and affixes that create sensationalization or Darwinianisms. Chinese is supposed to be an even more extreme example of an isolating language than English, but it too contains rules that create multi-part words such as compounds and derivatives. English, like free word ordered languages, has free ordering in strings of prepositional phrases, where each preposition marks the semantic role, marks the case, the semantic role of its noun phrase, as if it were a case marker. There you go. So we can have the package was sent from Chicago to Boston by Mary, indicating then source, so long as Chicago comes right after from, and destination, so long as Boston comes right after the preposition to. So it is either one or the other preposition that is marking Chicago as source and Boston as destination, and by marking Mary as the agent of this action, sending the package. But we can also say the package was sent by Mary to Boston from Chicago. The package was sent to Boston from Chicago by Mary, and so on. Conversely, in so-called scrambling languages at the other extreme, like World Piri, where the order is never completely free, and this applies to Spanish, right? That is said to be much freer than English is. But it is never free because we move around within certain limits. For example, auxiliaries must go in the second position in a sentence, which is rather like their positioning in English. English, like ergative languages, marks a similarity between the objects of transitive verbs, and subjects of intransitive verbs, such as in John broke the glass and the glass broke, an ergative representation in which the glass is still the patient that breaks, as in John broke the glass, but this appears as a happening. It is representing a situation as though there was no agency associated with it. So English is behaving like an ergative language somehow. English, like topic prominent languages and Spanish too, has a topic constituent in constructions like as for fish, I eat salmon, or John I never really liked. You know, this marked structure in which you have the direct object of liking fronted here. Something we also have in Spanish. Con respecto al pescado, solamente como salmón, por ejemplo. Like SOV languages, not too long ago, English availed itself of an SOV order, which is still interpretable in archaic expressions such as, with this ring I thee wed. So I subject, thee object, wed verb. Unlike classifier languages, English insists upon classifiers for many nouns. We cannot say a paper, but rather we say a sheet of paper, right? So English speakers say a piece of fruit, not to mean a part of a fruit, but rather a fruit in itself. And we have a blade of grass, a stick of wood, 50 head of cattle, and so on. So I'll stop this second video for the time being.